Good evening, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So a lot of people ask me, when is the Federal Reserve going to pivot? Like, when do you think? How far out? At what timeline? Something like that. That's not the way it's going to work. The Federal Reserve is waiting for a bunch of people to start feeling some serious pain. That's when the Federal Reserve will consider the pivot. Now, we have not seen pain yet. Yeah, true, there is layoffs taking place, and you're finding where there's a lot of recession indicators, and big names are out there talking about recession. But as far as the pain, we haven't seen that yet. Wait till you start hearing people talk about how they've lost everything that they've worked for, how their pension fund is like basically dried up and is gone, how they don't know what it is that they're going to do to save their dinner plate. That's the type of pain that I'm talking about. That's when you'll see the Federal Reserve start to reverse. Right now, the Federal Reserve is put into a position in which that it is very difficult for people to really wrap their heads around, because they didn't really put themselves in this position. It's a position in which they happen to be in. And it's one that we have talked about in the past. I said this could be a recession in which that we go into in that you don't see unemployment rise. And I know that's like one of the hardest things for anybody to wrap their heads around, considering that when you think about most recessions have two major components about it that people hate, right? One of them is you lose your job, and the other one is corporations get bailed out, right? But what if we have a situation in which we go into a recession and you don't have a rise in unemployment and the corporations have already been bailed out? Because that's really where I believe this is the recession that we're going into. A lot of people don't realize that during the pandemic that all these corporations were able to take out incredibly enormous amounts of debt while it was incredibly cheap. Right? The Federal Reserve was able to drive interest rates to a very low level. And when they were driven down, investors were looking for a fixed income of at least some sort of yield. Some sort of substantial yield could only be found inside of junk bonds. And so when these investors were jumping into junk bonds to get that return on their capital investment, it kept driving the yields down on all these corporations, and these corporations were gorging on debt. This was all during the pandemic, and we've talked about this many, many times on this channel. And now when these corporations were able to hire these people, right, hire all these people, it zapped all the employees that were out there. This is really where we lost a lot of the employees. People say, where all the workers go? Everybody said they went into retirement. Yeah, that's true. A bunch of them went to retirement. A bunch of them didn't get trained. A bunch of them didn't want to join the workforce. A bunch of them doing gig economy. But the real problem was that they all went into these corporations who had dumped a bunch of money into trying to expand their operations after they had gorged on incredibly cheap debt. That's really where the major bulk of the employees went. Now, here's the major issue with inflation, is that when these employees disappeared, the wages started to rise. As the wages go up, people start earning more money, they start becoming bigger consumers. Okay. Now, I do understand, and when people say, well, yeah, you spend all your extra money on inflation and all that other stuff, I get it. Yes, that is very true for the individual who did not shift, right? You didn't shift in wages, you didn't shift in position, you didn't shift in anything you did. You still earn the same money that you did a couple of years ago. Your bills are going up, right? All the problems of inflation are now exposed to you, but a great deal amount of people changed. Right? They moved up into, higher positions at their company, maybe moved on to different companies. They found getting out of the service industry and just moving into some other, place of business altogether. A lot of them found gig economy work. There was all kinds of shift to employees, but that expansion into the debt market was really where I think a lot of the employees had gone to. And now you're starting to find them show up when you see every time these layoffs take place in a tech company, mass amounts of layoffs start to take place. But at the exact same time, you're finding that new job, filing, like people coming into in the employment market, is still quite extensive. Like the unemployment part of things is not rising every time you see these great layoffs taking place, I guess is what I'm getting at. And that's where the Federal Reserve is looking for, because if you can get the unemployment to rise, then that means people would not be spending that money. Generally, when people are on unemployment, they're having difficulties making their bills. They're not spending that extra money or having extra money. In fact, they're cutting back on a lot of their expenses, and that's what the Federal Reserve is looking for. You can cut back on all the interest rate hikes, like all the interest rates, all you want, right? But if people are earning the money, then they're going to go out there and spend it, right? Now, if you back off on the amount of money that they are earning, then they will back off on the amount that they spend. And that's really what it comes down to. Because if you have more money in the system, then you're going to have more people out there trying to chase those goods and services with more money in the system. There's very little doubt about that, right? And that's really how everybody focuses. They say, when the Fed prints all this money, that causes inflation. It does, right? That you can't deny that. But you got to understand also that it's not just a matter of printing up the money and injecting it into the system. It's how it gets injected into the system, right? Quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4 hardly produced the inflation that the Fed was looking for, because most of it ended up as reserves on the big bank's balance sheet. And unless that money gets lent into the system, then it just sits there on those banks' balance sheet. But now when you take like these stimulus packages that we had during the pandemic and you hand everybody a bunch of money and you tell them go out there and spend it, now you have money from every direction, and everybody who has it enters in at the exact same moment, all channels at once. Now, when you do this, now you have the potential to have inflation. If you sever the supply chain at the exact same time, you're going to wipe out inventory, and you're definitely... Lost my light. There we go. You're going to wipe out inventory, and you're definitely going to see a supply and demand imbalance. And that's what we're suffering now. So yes, money printing did cause inflation, no doubt about it. But the sustained inflation that we are experiencing today is due to the supply chain imbalance, or the supply-demand imbalance due to that supply chain breakdown. And the Federal Reserve is not going to get the help back, right? We've already talked about this too. And so since the Fed is not going to get the help from the supply side of things, when you have the consumer damaged by higher interest rates, then they're going to look for it inside of the employment. So really, that's what the Federal Reserve is going to look for. All the stuff that you see take place out there with the recession, like, you're going to find that continue. All the pain and suffering, you're going to see some serious pain and suffering coming. The Fed isn't going to do anything about that. All that stuff is going to happen. The moment that the unemployment rise, right? Once that comes up and the people start feeling the pain of not spending that money into the economy, then you'll see the Fed reverse, right? And pivot on their Fed funds rates. But think about it like right now. People are like, man, this consumer is still out there. This consumer is still happening. Yeah, it's because they earn the money to do it. Right? Once they don't earn the money to do it anymore, then you'll see the Fed move. Right, you'll see the Fed start to change pace, or change course. Like this, the pace of interest rates, that is, I think that has more to do with a psychological game, and also the attempt for the Federal Reserve to get the Fed funds rate above 5%. I mean, when we think about the Fed funds rate being like the main tool of the Federal Reserve to combat a recession, typically they would want to drop that Fed funds rate 5%. They were completely out of ammo for the last, almost 15 years. And all of a sudden, here they got it back. Right? They got it back now. So I imagine that they're pretty stoked about that as well. As far as lost control, I don't know. I think they got control enough to get their Fed funds rates back. That was kind of a neat way of I wouldn't necessarily should go as far as saying neat, but that was certainly an interesting way of them being able to get that ammo back, right? I don't know. Anyway, that was Uneducated Economist babbling on about that. Uneducated Economist, you let me know.